This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. Here's the thing. For quite a long period of time while presenting this programme, you couldn't shut me up about Brexit. Do you remember? Not only did I talk about it every day, I relished talking about it every day because I felt naively that if you pointed out what was going to happen to enough people who believed that something very different was going to happen, we might actually be able to stop it from happening. That was, of course, the rationale behind calls for the second referendum. And I caught myself this morning addressing a story looking at what is actually going to happen, describing the reality that was predicted by anyone really who understood things, which rules out pretty much everybody in the current government and most of the British media. Anybody who understood the simplest premises knew that we would be reaching a point that we reach at the end of this month when food imports from the EU begin and the people importing the food will have to pay for the checks, seeing importers paying £29 for a single pack of bacon if you were trying to buy a single pack of bacon from a European-based country. And do you know what I did? I caught myself thinking, I don't know if I can do that. I caught my energy levels dipping. That's absolutely remarkable. Did you see what I did there? Well, you have to have been paying attention to the programme quite closely to realise that I just stopped myself from saying extraordinary. I'd said remarkable instead. Absolutely remarkable. Isn't it marvellous? So I'm going to need your help at 11 o'clock to revivify. And in fact, that is almost a topic in and of itself, isn't it? Those of us who are now being proved horribly right about Brexit every single day, how do we sustain our appetite for pointing it out? For reminding people that this is all entirely self-inflicted, for reminding each other that these are the people who, that the people who told us the lie have not been affected at all. Their careers haven't even been dented in many cases. And yet every single thing they said is now being proved horribly and catastrophically wrong on a daily basis. I think if we were given to hyperbole, or if we were the kind of people that apparently get excited about embroidery on football shirts, we would now be screaming traitor or what is the definition of treachery other than deliberately damaging your own country? If it's done through incompetence and ignorance rather than malign intent, does the treachery become any less? Is it diluted in any sense? I do not know. So I'm just giving you a heads up. I want some help with that, almost certainly coming up at 11 o'clock. It is 7 minutes after 10. Nick had a call this morning which really focused my mind. It was a call from South Africa, and it was a point you don't hear very often anymore. It was a point that you heard all the time when the terror attack of October the 7th was still fresh in our memories. And it was the plaintive request to talk more about the hostages that are still being held by Hamas. I presume most people didn't notice when Benjamin Netanyahu said that even if a hostage release deal was reached, his intention to launch a ground offensive in Rafah would continue anyway. So, once again, it's Netanyahu that lets down people who profess their support for what he's doing, because he's made it crystal clear that even if the hostages were released, it wouldn't end the carnage in Gaza. And similarly, of course, it is the families of the hostages that are being held who have become Netanyahu's most vociferous critics in Israel. But if you are either not paying proper attention or you're incapable of shifting your position, then it's all you've got left. You have to repeatedly insist that people are somehow ignoring the hostages or ignoring the atrocity of October the 7th. I could mention it every single minute of this show for the rest of the year, and I'd still get texts saying, why don't you ever mention it? Right? In fact, I'll find you one now. You probably think I'm exaggerating. And now I won't be able to find one, will I? Oh, no, here you go. Thank you, Oliver. James O'Brien continually only mentions Israeli injustices in its warfare tactics, but never mentions Hamas and the hostages, listening to the earlier call from a South African woman who states if hostages are released, then the IDF will cease its operations. And then, just for good measure, because you possibly think I exaggerate, I have listened to James O'Brien for over 6 years. He is most certainly anti-Semitic. Say that to my face, Oliver, and I'll sue you from here to kingdom come. It is 9 minutes after 10, and it is a helpful illustration from Oliver of what I'm talking about. The desperation now that people still supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu have to pretend that the conversation should be about something or anything else has reached, I think, breaking point. That is why the world is now united in calling for a ceasefire. It's why even Joe Biden has finally discovered some sort of backbone and told Israel in terms to stop killing civilians. Even an implication that arms sales may be halted unless there is an immediate ceasefire. I hope these words are simple enough for people to understand. And I also think it's pretty plausible to say that Benjamin Netanyahu will not stop. The release of the hostages is obviously not his priority, because he has made it clear that that would not signal a cessation of warfare in Gaza. So I'm terribly sorry to Oliver and to the lady in South Africa and to everybody else still clinging to the carcass of that idea. It's dead. It's gone. It's as dead as 33,000 Palestinians, the majority of whom, of course, are women and children. So that's gone. So then you're left with the other so-called goal, which was the eradication of Hamas. Now, to cling to that idea, you have to completely ignore the fact that Netanyahu favoured Hamas over the Palestinian Authority, was gentle in his approach to Hamas, to Qatar and its protection and support of Hamas leaders, precisely because Hamas are opposed to a two-state solution in much the same way that Benjamin Netanyahu is. So in order to rob the Palestinian Authority of support and validity, he has sat by and allowed Hamas to become a much greater force in the region. He was also, of course, in charge of protecting Israel on October the 7th. I'll say that again because many people seem to have forgotten. He was in charge of protecting the people of Israel on October the 7th. So I don't really think anybody can with a straight face claim that the continuing offensive in Gaza is likely to eradicate Hamas, not least because there are now thousands and thousands and thousands of orphans who blame Benjamin Netanyahu or Israel or both for the death of their parents. That to me doesn't seem to be a particularly reliable recipe for peace or for the removal of the motivation that lies behind Hamas's position at this point. So why is Netanyahu pursuing this course now that he has lost the support of everybody? And this is a question that anybody can answer. Even people who want him to continue pursuing this course can answer it, but you will, I'm afraid, have to work very hard to persuade me. Well, you can't persuade me that it's all about releasing the hostages because he has told us that it isn't. Okay? He has told us that it isn't, and his most vociferous critics, many of his most vociferous critics in Israel itself, the people who stormed the very Knesset the other day, are families of the hostages. So the idea that he speaks for or acts for them, I'm afraid, is dead in the water. So you can't do that. If you want to somehow explain to everybody how creating thousands and thousands and thousands of orphans, displacing 1.7 million people, is going to make them somehow more amenable or make them feel more warmly towards the government that has ordered it, that has caused the displacement, that has ordered the killing, that has facilitated the carnage, then I'm all ears. 0345 6060973. So why is Benjamin Netanyahu committed to this course even as his most powerful and influential allies have urged him to abandon it? That's the question. And of course, it's very, very important to remember that many people don't blame Israel. Many people blame Jews. And that causes problems way beyond the boundaries of Israel or Gaza or the West Bank or even the Middle East. That causes problems everywhere. That prompts anti-Semitic attacks in European countries. The idea that everybody born into the Jewish faith is either comfortable with or supportive of the continuing carnage in Gaza is profoundly and horribly wrong. But one of the most tragic side effects, I think, of labeling anybody who criticizes the Israeli government anti-Semitic is that the conflation, the other side of that coin, is that everybody Jewish is on the hook for what Israel does. They're both utterly ridiculous. I wonder if you've noticed that before. That they are the mirror images of each other. It is as disgusting to claim that anybody criticising Israel is anti-Semitic as it is to claim that everybody Jewish must somehow be supportive of what the IDF is doing in Gaza. I think that the allegations of anti-Semitism levelled at Alan Duncan are kind of nibbling at the edges of that second prejudice, the idea that it is anti-Semitic to suggest that someone Jewish is more loyal to Israel than they are to the UK, even if this is where they live. But think about that. I don't know that penny's ever dropped quite as loudly for me before. So to call everybody criticising Israel anti-Semitic is the same as claiming that everybody Jewish must support what Israel is currently doing. They're both incredibly offensive conflations, but one, of course, is rightly treated with disgust, whereas the other is mainstreamed into the heart of the British media, never mind, well, I say public discourse as opposed to public opinion, because public opinion was where Joe Biden has gone months ago. Public opinion was opposed to Israel's actions in Gaza months ago. Public opinion has been pretty clear now for, at least all of 2024. The calls for a ceasefire were not confined to almost all of the United Nations. They ran like Blackpool through a stick of rock through the populations of the member countries, even indeed the countries that were abstaining or voting against it in the cases of America and the UK, saw their leaders adopt positions that were at odds with the polling, with the opinion polling of the populations. So, why is Netanyahu still doing this? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Couple of quick texts. I shall read the first ones that have come in, and you then, of course, are welcome to contribute, to contradict, or to make entirely separate points as you see fit. But I shall read these, and then I shall open the phone lines, and then we'll take a brief break. So this is from Martin, who says, I have to listen to your show on catch-up due to work. However, I hope that you can convey my message even if you aren't covering Gaza today. Your handling of the situation has been full of humanity, balance, and your logical quotes, just counting, end quotes. I read that just as a simple counter to what Oliver said. I hope what I have to say will remove the scales from the eyes of those who don't realise how the killing of innocent people will be a recruitment drive for Hamas or their successors. I grew up in nationalist West Belfast in the 60s, 70s and 80s during dark and violent times when ordinary people faced threats from the IRA, from loyalist paramilitaries and, yes, from the British Army. Events on Bloody Sunday in 1972, however, caused the biggest recruitment drive the Provos had ever seen. That's the Provisional IRA. Our troubled history continued for a further 26 years. Hatred and distrust between Catholic and Protestant nearly took us into the abyss on many occasions. Gaza and Israel are obviously there now. However, we stepped back. I despair at the events of the last 6 months and the deaths of 33,000 plus, or 34,000 plus, sorry, he's written. However, because that includes the 1,200 killed by Hamas on October the 7th, quite rightly. However, I hold a glimmer of hope. Through a process, we established a peace, albeit imperfect, and now we don't kill each other. If we could do it, surely the greatest of enemies can. And that's from Martin, who speaks from Belfast. And this from Chris, who is in Cumbria. He writes, my response to your question at 9:45, which is why is Netanyahu continuing on this course? He is now confident that nobody is actually going to stop his forces doing whatever he wants. We might bleat, and even the US might complain, but nobody will actually do anything. He may have accepted that his time in charge is limited and that he might even face prosecution in Israel for his behaviour last October. So his motivation, I think, is similar to other leaders coming close to the end of their time in office. He is building his legacy. He might not finish the cleansing of Gaza, but he will be seen as the leader who did most to create the greater Israel. And we will do nothing. I hope Chris is wrong, and I hope Martin is right. But I recognise and respect the freedom that both men have to hold and express both of those opinions. And you have that freedom too. You can ring today and tell me any answer you like within the realms of legality and libel law, any answer you like as to why you think Benjamin Netanyahu insists on pursuing the course of carnage in Gaza, even as his most reliable, doughty and historic allies plead with him to stop. That is the question. They are pleading with him to stop killing civilians. He is currently refusing. Why? Because under almost any objective analysis, the support of America in particular and the West in general, but America in particular, has been perceived as intrinsic to anything and everything that Israel does that could be construed as controversial. And now America is saying, please stop. And Benjamin Netanyahu is currently saying no. Why? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 22 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question, happily, for want of possibly of a better word, is one that everybody engaged in this issue, everybody engaged in this war can answer. Why is Benjamin Netanyahu committed to his current course, which I would describe as carnage, although that's a subjective position, of course, his current course of carnage in Gaza, when even his most reliable and committed international allies are pleading with him to stop. Sylvie is in Harrow to kick things off. Sylvie, what would you like to say?
Yes, I agree with everything you have said, James. I'm a proud British Jew, and what Netanyahu has done, he's set Israel back 60 years, and where people did always support Israel, generally speaking, because it is the only democracy in the Middle East, he is only interested in one thing, himself, his survival, which he knows is coming to an end anyhow. He's never believed in a two-state solution, which I have always strongly believed in. The only way Israel will ever have peace is living side by side with the Palestinians. And the damage that he has done, and I feel every day I wake up, I cannot believe that Israel has committed what they have done. Obviously, what Hamas did was despicable. There's just no words. But to go, I was always worried that Netanyahu would go overboard.
When do you think he did? When did you, on a very personal level, Sylvia? And I find this question almost impossible to answer, but I insist on asking it all the time. I don't know why. When did for you personally? When did your scales tip from, if you like, from justifiable response to unjust?
I was from the very beginning, to tell you the truth. Right. I thought, oh my God, now we are going to see something that we've never seen before. Right. And the reputation of Israel now around the world, and it plays into the hands. This is what Iran and Hamas, Hezbollah, all the terrorist groups, it's playing into their hands. And as you so rightly said, the poor children, I mean, they are the next terrorists, because what they have experienced, losing family, under the most terrible circumstances, starvation. And the moment Israel said they were going to cut off the water, that was an alarm signal as well.
Gosh.
And Israel, of all, we've all suffered the Holocaust and everything else, and it's just, I am so. I
can hear it in your voice.
Into words how I feel.
No, I can hear it in your voice. And you mentioned the encroaching famine, which there is still some denialism about, but which the international aid agencies are pretty clear is necessary. And do you know what? I think apart from death, obviously, but in terms of words, what breaks my heart the most is to hear you saying that 60 years of goodwill has been squandered. Is it as simple as Netanyahu's narcissism or ambition? Do you really see it in such binary terms, Sylvie?
Yes, because he never believed in a one-state, a two-state solution.
No, we know that.
He didn't believe in it, and he took his eye off the ball. He is to blame. I mean, they have the best security in the world.
I hear you, and possibly distracted by his own political and indeed legal troubles, or as it has been suggested by wiser men than me, that he actually welcomed the rise of Hamas because they squeezed out Palestinian Authority, voices that would have been more committed to a two-state solution. All of that, of course, I guess, is for the history books. How does this end? How does this chapter end, Sylvie? I don't see
a good future for Israel at the moment, because it's played into the enemies who are this is exactly what they wanted, because they want to. I mean, Hamas has said in their charter they want to eradicate every single Jew and Israel. So it's I don't see good things in the short term.
No.
Unless Israel gets a good leader
who can somehow make it clear to the remaining people in Gaza that they are no longer cannon fodder, or whatever the phrase would be, because essentially you're right to remind us of Hamas's charter, because what you have now after this exercise by Netanyahu is a perception on both sides of that border between the Gaza Strip and Israel that the people on the other side want to completely eradicate you. Palestinian children who've lost their parents are going to believe that Israel is committed to the eradication of Palestinian people in Gaza, just as Israeli people believe that Hamas and therefore perhaps many other Palestinians are dedicated to the eradication of Israel. So it ends in one of three ways. Either one side succeeds in the eradication of their enemy, or the other side succeeds in the eradication of their enemy, or they reach the rapprochement that Sylvie dreams of, that Sylvie describes, and that I think everybody sensible recognises. We go back to our friend in Belfast at the very beginning of this hour as the only truly feasible way out of this mess, which makes the analysis of Netanyahu's motivation almost irresistible. But I would remind you that you're welcome to resist it. 0345 6060 973. It is all about him. It's all about him and the huge failure of the British political establishment and most of the British media to recognise the difference between Benjamin Netanyahu's interests and Israel's interests is a stain that will take generations, I think, to remove. Thank you, Sylvie. And it can't have been easy for you. An awful lot of admiration for your clarity and passion coming in via my inbox. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. There's one, but you can grab the phone line that Sylvie is vacating if you're quick. Meanwhile, Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10:33 is the time, and remember that I think a useful companion piece to Sylvie's call is that observation that to call anybody criticising Netanyahu or Israel anti-Semitic is as dangerous and as despicable as claiming that if you are Jewish, you must be in favour of the carnage in Gaza. And that's the problem. That's why Alicia Kearns warns of the danger of Netanyahu's actions affecting all of us, because the terrorist groups that are motivated by, I mean, how would you describe it? The actions of Israel, or solidarity, perceived in their own mind, solidarity with the people of Gaza, they may take the fight to foreign countries that they feel have been too supportive of Netanyahu. So that is a point made by the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee that should not be ignored. Similarly, the attack upon the Iranian embassy in Damascus brings the Israeli people into some sites that they were not previously in. So the question of why on earth Netanyahu continues to do things that endanger everybody, including, perhaps more than anybody, the people of Israel, is more urgent than it's ever been. 10:35 is the time. Robert's in Ipswich. Robert, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, mate.
How you doing?
I'm good, thanks. What's on your mind?
Right. My point is, we're at the stage now that Netanyahu has created a rogue state. And that's basically, if you look at the definition, a national state regarded as breaking international law and posing a threat to the security of other nations. And I think it's time, it's gone so far now, I think it's time that the leaders of the international world, whether it's the UN, the Americans who have the influence, and the British, actually forced him to step down.
Where I don't know how that would work, but where does that definition come from?
That's the dictionary definition.
Is it?
A rogue Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms, if I were to take two politicians from different ends of the political spectrum in this country, we've got the former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw suggesting this morning that there is no doubt that international law has been broken. And then we've got the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Alicia Cairns, saying that this is now endangering, of course, other countries. You there you have it. You'd call, as your first witness, you'd call the Labour former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. As your second witness, you call the Conservative chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they would deliver you a very compelling case for your description of Israel as being now a rogue state, or Netanyahu having gone rogue.
And
why? Why is he? Why do you know? I mean, I know that's not necessarily what you've rung in to answer, but do you have a view on why? Because if you just woken up now and all of this was being described to you, the question that would rise above all others is, what the hell is Netanyahu playing at? And that question may have been in your mind last October, last November, last December, but today, that question is it's Spinal Tap territory, Robert. Someone's turned the volume up to 11. What is Netanyahu doing? Why is he doing what he's doing?
Well, it's like all these despots, James. It's power. It's like Amin, Robert Mugabe, Gaddafi. As soon as they get the ultimate power, they just do what they want, basically. And
I have to remind you that he's the beneficiary of democratic elections. So there are distinctions to be drawn. I think important distinctions.
He's gone so far over the top. I mean, I know you asked this question many times.
Yes.
Where did we draw the line?
Yes.
Where did it turn? Where did it turn? Now, do you remember the old adage, which I don't agree with, an eye for an eye?
Well, it's not just an old adage. It's an Old Testament teaching, of course.
Yeah, I know, but I use it as that.
Yeah.
I did the calculation, and at the moment, roughly, it's approximately 213 eyes of every Palestinian to one that was killed or
Bloody
taken
hell.
hostage on the 7th. There's a little calculation for you. 213.6.
Yeah, I mean that is
eye
grim.
for an eye. And that's just to date.
And that's why the question of why he's committed to continuing down this course becomes ever more acute. Flipping heck, Robert. I mean, that's some fairly grisly maths, isn't it? But, that's not an opinion, as I am fond of saying. That is literally counting. It is 10:38. Is that an interesting little aside for you? The Israeli government spokesman, whose curious background and a complete lack of qualifications for any sort of formal official government job, has been very fascinatingly explored by the Times of Israel. That chap who was all over your TVs and radios not long ago, Elon Levy, got fired after essentially saying things that appeared to be untrue about the access of aid into Gaza to the British Foreign Secretary, to David Cameron. It's a now deleted tweet in which he insisted that there was absolutely no hindering or blocking of aid into Gaza, which seemed to be at odds with the available evidence. Suella Braverman has now gone down exactly the same path. Suella Braverman has claimed in the last couple of days, and she's in Israel, she's claimed that she knows Israel isn't in breach of international law because she has seen photographs of aid being delivered. She denies the international aid agency's warning that famine is imminent because she has seen photographs of food. So I just want you to focus on this for a minute. If you're struggling to keep up with the madness, you can be fired as an official Israeli government spokesman for pursuing the position that Suella Braverman is now pursuing as to use Robert's word, as a rogue conservative backbencher without any sanction whatsoever. So denying famine or denying aid blockades or denying... so Braverman has been put in an incredible situation. She was denying that there were any hindrances to aid getting into Gaza before Israel announced that it was going to open up one of the gates that constituted a blockade on aid getting into Gaza. But is anyone going to discipline her? Can you imagine? Spineless Sunak? I don't really like those sort of nicknames. I prefer more schoolyard nicknames like Digby Pudding Jones. But can you imagine Sunak doing anything to discipline Braverman? Even Theresa May fired Priti Patel for making secret visits as a member of government. Braverman, of course, is not a member of government. But that is another moment that we should probably pause and reflect upon. That idea that you can be fired as an Israeli government spokesman for denying that aid is being prevented from getting into Gaza, but you can say it as a conservative backbencher with apparent impunity. Bulama is in Lambeth. Bulama, what would you like to say?
James, it's always a great pleasure listening to you.
Ditto.
I listen to
Bulama.
Yeah. I listened to the first text message you read. I just want to tell you, James, that when a presenter like you stops to attract smears, then he is dead. So you will never stop attracting those kinds of smears from people who just hate you for your fantastic
I don't know that
work.
they hate me. They hate what they see in the mirror that I hold up, I think, and it's Netanyahu sometimes that they see. But thank you. But yes. Anyway, on with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, listening to the question, I thought there could be three possible explanations for why Netanyahu insists on continuing, and there could be more, and these are not mutually exclusive. Now, the first is that, James, a bully doesn't stop because you are begging him. A bully only stops when there are consequences to their action.
Yes.
You see, the West keeps telling Netanyahu what you are doing is bad. They keep condemning him publicly. But until yesterday and a few months back, when we saw an isolated incident, they never told him that there is consequences or there are conditions for their support. They tell him, we will support you whatever, but please don't do this or please don't do that. And that's not how dealing with bullies work. Remember when we talk about the hostage exchange, the hostage deal a few months back,
yes.
It only went through after Biden had publicly lambasted him in the media, saying, look, you are isolating Israel now and you are making it an international pariah. It was a few weeks or the week after that the hostage deal continued. He didn't want the deal. That's why even a day before the deal, he kept saying, I will continue to attack even if the hostages were released. And of course, then yesterday we saw Biden telling him, now we are going to make our support conditional upon you doing this and this and this. And now he has admitted and he's saying we are going to start opening humanitarian routes.
And yet preventing humanitarian routes is one of the things that the International Court in The Hague is looking at. That's one of the things that constitutes a war crime. And so oddly, you're the lawyer, not me, Bulama, for people who don't know. Oddly, that looks like evidence, doesn't it? If you wanted to prove that there were efforts in place to prevent aid making its way into Gaza, then announcing that you're going to open a passage for aid to get into Gaza is almost an admission that yesterday you were preventing it from happening, surely.
Exactly. I mean, I was going to use the word admission. This is admission by his conduct that I am going to open more humanitarian route, but you also have other pieces of real evidence, like the people who are serving, according to many humanitarian organizations and the United Nations in Gaza Strip, the aid convoys that had to return, but yes. Also the attacks on them, the killing of the 7 members that you discussed yesterday on the show. Even though, like you said, now Braverman is more rogue than Netanyahu himself. She is denying what Netanyahu is admitting, and
that's the fact. I'm glad you see it that way as well, because sometimes I'm a little bit wary about going where my understanding leads me. But because of the timing of this, she's denied a problem, and then a few hours later, he's announced a solution to the problem that she claimed didn't exist.
Exactly, you couldn't make it up.
Yes.
And James, now of course the U.S. government is making some effort. In the UK, we have seen many calls of Rishi Sunak for Rishi Sunak to stop the sale of weapons because international law is being violated. I noted yesterday that the newspapers that were reporting that were also reporting that he was threatening to exit the European Court on Human Rights, and I think it wouldn't look good on him to now punish Israel for violating international human rights, and then a few weeks later or a few months later...
You're doing that thing you always do, Bulama, you see. This is your academic background coming to the fore. You're applying the laws of logic to the actions of British politicians, which unfortunately, is not a waste of time, but it's a fool's errand. Sunak knows that the Good Friday Agreement, never mind the trade agreement that we have with the European Union, for what that's worth, is absolutely contingent upon membership of the European Court on Human Rights. He knows all that. He's just trying to win over the votes of Reform Party fans who are too stupid to understand things. But I hadn't thought of that dimension, the idea that he is casting himself in the role of giving lectures on international law and human rights to a country while telling his own supporters that he wants to pull out of those sort of institutions because they're foreign. Balama, I'm a little late for the break. How's the PhD coming along?
It's going on very well.
Good. I worry when you call me. I worry when you call me that that I'm distracting you from your PhD thesis.
No, you are not, James. My external supervisor, my external examiner was appointed last week, and now I am ready for the final defense, hopefully in the next few months.
Gosh,
I had two other possible explanations, but we could talk them next time. Hopefully,
we will. I fear that
we don't need to talk about this again, but if we need to, then...
I fear that we will be talking about it, and I always look forward to your contributions. Thank you, Balama. Balama Bukati is a regular caller to the program, but in other news, he's also a prominent Nigerian analyst and human rights lawyer, currently doing his PhD at SOAS. It is 10:47.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10 minutes to 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Lewis says, I remember Balama's call from a few months ago. He was correct then and he's correct now. You're not wrong. One of the clearest explanations, as you used the word genocide, Lewis, which obviously he hasn't, and nor have I. I'm comfortable with ethnic cleansing as a description. It's one that I can defend. Genocide is in the gift of international courts. But one of the clearest explanations I've heard, I'm looking forward to his book on Boko Haram. Michael is in Tel Aviv, in Israel. Michael, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, good morning, James. Long time no speak. So I think there is this perception that, so I'm not an Israeli citizen, but I'm obviously seeing a lot of people around and speak to a lot of people, as well as a lot of sort of foreign visitors and that sort of thing. There is a perception that Israel doesn't care about what's happening. And this isn't my experience sort of on the ground, if you like. People do care very much. And if even if you take the number of Palestinians killed, and if you cynically say, well, half of them were terrorists and half of them were inflated, even if it's just 5,000 people.
Yeah, just for the record, I know you know this, but I completely reject that analysis personally. The IDF claims that this percentage were terrorists, but I know what you're saying. We're not disagreeing with each other. Carry on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just saying, even if it was 5,000, it is an absolute tragedy. One person, if it was your relative, would be a tragedy. Yes. So no one, and everyone hates that. And so when you had a caller just a couple of calls ago who was comparing the sort of the number of people killed on 7th October, and of course there have been soldiers and people killed since in Israel, yes. And that comparing it to the number of people killed in Gaza, it's not really like for like. There is a big difference between it is collateral damage. There is no evidence that Israel wants to kill civilians, and it is seen by every Israeli I've spoken to and foreigner in the country as a tragedy. And what we don't know is...
can't let that pass, Michael.
Go on.
You can't kill tens of thousands. Half of them are children, mate. You can't claim that was all accidental.
I haven't seen evidence that there wouldn't be, but it has to be.
How about ordnance that is launched without any particular concern for who and where it's going to impact? Stuff that is not targeted. I think the word is dummy bombs, and the last statistic I saw was about 40 or 50% of the ordnance used in the earliest days of the conflict were dummy bombs, which you have no control over who they kill.
Well, I think that's true, but I think it's part of a strategy. I think if there was a clinical way to remove Hamas, which everyone in Israel wants to do and agrees is their choice.
There isn't a clinical way, and there isn't an unclinical way either.
But that's why it's collateral damage.
I just hate that phrase. Collateral damage is like friendly fire, isn't it? What about the aid workers? Three separate drones targeting very deliberate vehicles, one of which contained people who'd got out of the last one and survived and clambered into the new one, and then they blew that one up as well. Is that collateral damage?
It's not.
So what's the difference?
Clearly went very wrong. Well, in the case of the aid workers, it was clearly going to always look so bad that I can't believe there would be any strategy in doing it.
Okay, so here's a building full of people that might contain an enemy. We'll blow it up. Here's a car full of people that might contain an enemy. We'll blow that up. One's collateral damage and one isn't. How come? Explain that to me.
Well, one is accidental, and the other one, I don't know what the explanation is, but presumably there was a assumed target in the building, and ugly though it may be.
I've read reports that there was an assumed target in one of the aid cars. Haaretz has reported they believe there was. I don't think it's necessarily true, but you can claim we thought there was a Hamas fighter in the car. It's a rationale that's given up for blowing up ambulances, isn't it? That Hamas used. No, this is important. Because you can't use the word collateral damage like that. Unless you can explain to me the difference between blowing up a building full of people because it might have a terrorist in it and blowing up a car full of aid workers because it might have a terrorist in it. Either they're both collateral damage or neither of them are.
Well, the government would be the Israeli government would be the first to claim that there was an assumed threat in those aid cars, and even they haven't said that. So that clears to be some kind of complete, whether it's a rogue operative, a complete, there is an inquiry.
You can't call it collateral damage, mate. There's 9,000 dead children. It's not. It's a deliberate killing of 30,000 Palestinian people in the hope of catching some terrorists in that net. That's not collateral damage.
You're not James, you're not providing any logic for that. It's not deliberate.
I'm giving you the number. So who fired guns by accident? Who launched missiles by accident? What's the opposite of accident?
I don't understand.
The opposite of accident is deliberate. So either these missiles were fired by accident or they were fired deliberately. If they were fired deliberately in the full knowledge that countless civilians were going to be killed in the process, the killing of the civilians is deliberate.
I wouldn't agree that.
Talk me through the reasons why. Talk me through what the problems in the logic.
Well, for the same reason that if I decide to paint my bedroom with red paint and spill it on the floor, I spilt it. My intention wasn't to spill it on the floor. It just unfortunately happened as a consequence because I'm klutzy. I don't know if I can even come down to that level of discourse, but I will out of respect for you, Michael. Thank you. I always like it when you dumb it down for me.
Well, I'm not dumbing it down. I'm a little bit disgusted by the analogy because we're talking about dead children and you're comparing them to spilt paint. But I appreciate that I put some pressure on you in the moment to justify what is to me an unjustifiable position.
James, that's unfair. There's not an equivalent.
No, mate, you're the one that suggested it. So
but it's an analogy.
Let me help you.
That's not how analogies work, James. That's not how analogies work.
Let me help you with your analogy. Is it possible, and this is what I mean by being a little reluctant to come down to this level, is it possible to paint a bedroom without spilling any paint?
It depends.
Mate, it's your analogy.
Okay, if there is Lego all over the floor and kids running around with
Is it possible to paint a bed? Well, then you clear the Lego and you tell the kids to stay out of the room and then you go in and paint it. So the decision not to clear the Lego or not to tell the kids to stay out of the room and the subsequent spilling of paint is on the person that decided to undertake the painting. It's not upon the Lego or the children, is it, Michael?
Well, it's not a perfect analogy. I was trying to...
You were defending it 30 seconds ago, so let's ignore that analogy. Let's leave the spilled paint out of it. If you launch a missile knowing that it's going to kill civilians, is the killing of those civilians deliberate or accidental?
It is. It's neither. It's not deliberate. It is a consequence.
Okay, so let me say it again. You deliberately launch a missile knowing that civilians will die. Is the killing of the civilians deliberate?
No, it's a consequence. It's a consequence, but it's not the main.
Is it a deliberate consequence?
A deliberate consequence. It's not the intention.
No, but you know it's going to happen, so it is the intention.
Yes. Well, it's not the intention.
It is the intention. You know it's going to happen.
Well, there's a difference between. That's not what an intention means.
Okay.
If there was another way, they would do it.
Well, we've already been there. If they went after terrorists in Gaza in the same way that they would go after terrorists in Israel, we would know what the other way looked like, wouldn't we?
If the terrorists were hiding in a hospital, what's going to happen? In London, I live near a hospital. If there was a huge terrorist cell in the basement, patients would die.
But the proof of that hasn't even been provided after the hospitals have been destroyed.
Oh, absolutely was. The last 3 days, there have been a lot of footage of what was found in Al-Shifa.
This is footage from the IDF.
Okay. But
so we're back to where we were 2 days ago. So why won't they let international journalists in to check?
Well, because
let me steer you back to the question that we're asking today, which is why is Netanyahu who embarked upon this course even as all of his allies abandon him?
What you mean since 7th of October? This course?
No, I mean essentially since the aid workers were killed deliberately, and people like Joe Biden and David Cameron and other previous allies have called upon him to cease fire immediately. Why is he resisting those calls?
Well, I think the ceasefire is a red herring, because when people talk about a ceasefire, they talk about Israel ceasefiring.
Yeah, okay. But it's not a red herring, is it? Because it's what Joe Biden has called upon Benjamin Netanyahu to do. That is the question.
Joe Biden's calling for it because there's an election this year, but he knows it can't work because Hamas are not going to lay down their arms.
So you're answering questions that I'm not asking. Why is Netanyahu continuing on this course despite the fact that all of his international allies have now abandoned him, that his popularity levels in Israel have gone through the floor, that the families of the hostages are among his most vociferous critics, and yet he remains completely committed to the course that you acknowledge, for want of a better word, will accidentally cause the deaths of tens of thousands of more civilians? Why is he embarked upon? Why is he dedicated, committed to this cause?
Well, the course of what I think partly because he's Netanyahu and his number one motivation is himself. He wants to survive because he knows he's got very limited time. The hostage families.
These people are being killed. They're being sacrificed on the altar of Benjamin Netanyahu's vanity, and you're here to defend it.
No, I think partly right now what he's doing is that there is an existential threat continuously from Hamas. They, crossed a line which he had to react to after 7th of October. Hamas has to be removed in the same way.
You're not answering the question I asked, because the people I'm describing, the allies I'm describing, agreed with that on October the 8th and October the 9th. They don't agree with it now. So that has changed. That rationale has changed. That argument no longer washes. The idea that you're going to eradicate Hamas by creating a new generation of orphans is palpably absurd. Why is Netanyahu still pretending that it isn't? With the support, respectfully, with the support of people like you.
Let's not claim I have any support for him at all. I didn't before the 7th of October, and I don't now.
You support the continuing offensive in Gaza.
I support the removal of Hamas. I wouldn't claim to be a military expert to know any better way to do it.
And you believe that it can be achieved by killing more and more and more children.
Hamas will not negotiate nor lay down their arms. We're not dealing with Sinn Féin.
I'm just clarifying your own position. I'm just clarifying your own position. You want to bring Sinn Féin into it, you'd have to explain to me why the British government didn't go into Catholic areas of Belfast and kill everybody in the hope of catching some terrorists. So why is Netanyahu still on this course, despite the fact that everybody who previously supported him has abandoned him?
Because Hamas need to be removed, and the only way to remove them is to do it physically.
Right. How's that working out for you?
Well, it's an absolute tragedy for everyone.
No, I mean, how's it going? How's it going? How do you feel looking at the world now in terms of whether Hamas is in a weaker or stronger position for the next generation, whether enemies of Israel are being strengthened or weakened by Netanyahu's actions at the moment? Simple question.
I think clearly international relations are under strain, but that's because of in each country.
Are the enemies of Israel being strengthened or weakened by Benjamin Netanyahu's actions?
The enemies of Israel, that's mostly Iran and a few others. Are they being strengthened? I think that most of the enemies of Israel are enemies of the rest of the world, so it's a transient situation.
So the people who wish Israel harm, individuals or institutions, countries or civilians, do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is discouraging them from their hatred of Israel or encouraging more of it?
Well, it's absolutely very useful to them to.
Don't spill any paint, eh?
Right. You too. Thank you, James.
It's 3 minutes after 11.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
7 minutes after 11 is the time. So, I suppose we should have some gratitude to Michael for articulating the position that no longer able to claim, of course, that it's all about securing the release of the hostages, because Netanyahu has shot that particular fox. But you can just about claim, as we heard, that you can support what is happening in Gaza, even as the rest of the world calls for it to stop, by subscribing to the belief that it would somehow eradicate Hamas, and that there is no number of dead civilians that would render the professed pursuit of living terrorists unjustifiable. Which takes us back to that Daily Mail, Daily Mail headline yesterday, which talked about how the response can sometimes outweigh the original sin. Which, that's a haunting phrase. And I think perhaps the reason why I was uncomfortable with Michael's analogy about paint is that quite often, and I think this week more than any other, the relativism of human response, the relativism of humanity itself has been on display. That the fact that the killing of 3 British aid workers can cause so much more outrage, upset, heartbreak than the killing of 33,000 Palestinian people, some of whom absolutely, certainly will have been terrorists, would have been Hamas members and Hamas supporters and Hamas sympathizers. But the massive majority won't have been, especially the children, not capable of criminal responsibility under British law. But nonetheless, that paint analogy just got under my wire a little bit. And I'm definitely not apologising. I'm just explaining. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. And the question remains. I think we'll continue with this question. It's really important. You have Biden now describing or calling for Israel to stop killing civilians. You have Rishi Sunak being urged to publish legal advice on arms sales to Israel. You must protect civilians or risk losing our support, Biden adds in his call to Netanyahu. You've got a former Lord Chancellor, Charles Faulkner, who served under Tony Blair, warning ministers that they must prove they are not complicit in serious allegations as the aid crisis deepens in Gaza. Those allegations are that the aid is being prevented from reaching Gaza. Denying that allegation, refuting that, attempting to refute that allegation, saw one Israeli government spokesman, although we learned from the Times of Israel that you can achieve that job description in incredibly unrigorous circumstances. It was enough to get them fired. But Suella Braverman can say it publicly with no consequences whatsoever. And of course, you have the comments from Alan Duncan yesterday about some of his colleagues, which are now under investigation by the Tory party for alleged anti-Semitism. But the British angle is that Sunak is prepared to suspend arms sales if their own legal advice suggests that the state has broken international law. This goes back to January, I think, when Alicia Kearns asked David Cameron what the legal advice was, and David Cameron said, do you know what David Cameron said? The Foreign Secretary asked what the legal advice was on whether or not Israel, our ally, was breaking international law. Do you know what David Cameron said? God, I see a lot of paper, I think he said. A lot of paper, much paper passes the old deskaroo. Can't remember all of it. No idea what the current legal advice is on the bloodiest conflict unfolding pretty much on the planet at the moment, and where we're firmly aligned with one side. Can't remember whether or not our own lawyers are telling us. Can't remember. It's extraordinary, isn't it? 11:11 is the time. Some of you running with Michael's analogy. Zach says, what do you do if you end up with more paint spilt than actually ends up on the walls? It's collateral damage, mate. Weren't you listening? Adam's in Sydenham. Adam, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
First time calling.
Very welcome.
Get my thoughts. What I'm calling to say is two things can basically exist at the same time.
Yes.
So on the one hand, Netanyahu is, I would call him like a little fascist, and his government actually does have Jewish supremacists in it.
Yes, it does. It's got former terrorists in it, or sympathisers with terrorist movements, prescribed movements.
I'm sure if some of them not all of the government. Some have got their way. They would like greater Israel to happen, and they would love to make as many settlements as possible. I think that's totally true. And I think, of course, because of the judicial reforms last year, that Netanyahu has a big, I mean, October 7th, it lands squarely on him.
Yes.
So I think all that is true. I think also at the same time, no matter if you had the most, everyone said, okay, Israel has a right to defend itself. And I'm not saying it does or it doesn't.
Sure.
But even if you had the most kibbutzi left-wing government engaging in Gaza, I think, is simply an impossible task. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. I'm only saying that I don't think, from my understanding, that there has been such a difficult situation in which a enemy group has so thoroughly embedded themselves in the population after, building a network of tunnels the size of the New York subway system over 18 years. Mm. It goes under everywhere. So I'm not saying like this is right or this is wrong. I'm saying regardless of who would have led this war, I think it would have been a massacre, whatever the outcome.
Well, except that the infiltration of Israel by Hamas terrorists in normal circumstances would have seen the government of the victim country chased out of town at 100 miles an hour. But I mean, what is the point of blockading an entire population because of your fears that a minority of extremists in their midst wish you harm, and they're not being on the ball enough to prevent them from committing that harm? True,
but to push back, the blockade is there as well because I think like 30,000 missiles has come in the last 15 years. Like it's not. I agree, but
that's more evidence that the blockade is pointless.
True, but I mean, it's difficult. But of course, Hamas also has a role to play in this, and the world needs to remember billions of dollars of aid have gone there, and unfortunately,
it's aid that keeps people. It's aid that keeps people alive, because we're seeing what happens when that aid isn't going in, and we've got the warnings. Well, not even the warnings, but the reality of imminent famine unfolding in real time under our very eyes. I guess we're back, aren't we? And I agree with the idea of holding two thoughts in your head at the same time. But we're back to the question of whether there is ever any too much, and the only way you can avoid that question is by claiming that it's all. It's all somehow justified. That's where phrases like collateral damage move into it. And that hinges upon a belief that the eradication of Hamas is possible. And it obviously isn't.
So I don't have the answer, but I'm generally curious because, most of the world has said on October 8th, Israel's got a right to respond.
Yes, but no one, and then we just very casually used the word proportionate, didn't we? And we started pushing quite early to try and pin down precisely what proportionate meant. And the impossibility of doing so probably should have chilled us even more than it actually did at the time, because there'll be some people still claim, in fact, we spoke to one a moment ago, who would still claim that what's happening now is proportionate, even as the rest of the world recognises that we've crossed that Rubicon.
Totally. I feel like it's a difficult position to hold, but
something had to be done, but not necessarily this. It just sounds too woolly, doesn't it? But I think that's probably where we both are. It sounds
totally woolly, but you ping pong back and forth because the tactical situation and the political situation, it goes round in a circle forever. So
you need leadership in both. And this is what you're describing as naive to the point of impossible. You need leadership, except for history teaching us that it is possible until, of course, Israeli Prime Minister gets assassinated by an Israeli extremist. But you need leaders on both sides who genuinely believe in and move towards a two-state solution. And what we've ended up with is leaders on both sides passionately dedicated to the opposite of a two-state solution, both passionately opposed to it. So, I mean, that's both a pessimistic analysis and grounds for very, very cautious optimism. You swing the pendulum back to the days of Yitzhak Rabin. I don't know, maybe that's naive to the point of impossibility as well. Thank you, Adam. Thank you. I enjoyed your first call. I hope it's not your last. The time now is 11:16.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11 is the time. It's yes, I hear you. As a former security researcher, I'm chilled by the report, says Phil, into the Lavender Program. We have talked about it. I may play you the interview that Krishnan did on Channel 4 News last night with the, I think with the whistleblower on this. It rather gives the lie to old Michael's claim that the collateral damage, there is no deliberate targeting of civilians, but it's 7.5 minutes long, so I don't know if we can play all of that. Should we have a little look at it and see if, because this Lavender Program has really popped up. A caller mentioned it earlier in the week, and it's the AI that is used to target, to determine targets by the Israeli military. And there's a suggestion here with the that it even if it's a male voice that is picked up by the microphones, that then becomes grounds for attack. I'll try and find you the relevant bits. A few of you asking me about William Ragg, and I mean, I'm not deliberately avoiding the subject. I don't know what to say about it, really. This is a fellow an MP who made contact with someone on Grindr, a potential sexual partner, I presume. I believe that's how the Grindr works, and sent compromising pictures of himself, and consequently got a form of blackmail under which he then shared phone numbers of other members of the political establishment, members of parliament and parliamentary workers who were then also contacted. I mean, what do you even say about that? I don't know, but that's the story. If you can think how that could possibly be turned into a phone-in, I'll give you the money myself. 03456060973. You can WhatsApp me your treatment of the topic, and we'll have a think about doing it from 12. But in the meantime, such an important conversation and such an extraordinary shift in. That's the first time I've said extraordinary today. I'm allowed one or two a day, 1 or 2 an hour. Rome wasn't built in a day. Such a remarkable shift in position, which we detailed yesterday, and which I'm still reeling from, particularly that Daily Mail headline talking about how sometimes the revenge can outweigh the original sin. And here we are discussing it, and yet Netanyahu, I thought that Balama's analysis that he will only ever do as little as he can when he has no choice was irresistible. So I will now open up an aid route that is currently closed, even as that throws under the bus allies and former spokespeople who claimed that there were no actual obstacles to aid getting into Gaza being presided over by the Israeli government at all. Suella Braverman once again rendered unspeakably stupid by the people that she professes to support, a few hours after stating that it was a lie to claim, or that it was wrong to claim, that aid was being prevented from getting into Gaza. And do you know how she knew this? She's seen some photographs. Benjamin Netanyahu announces he's going to open up one of the routes for aid into Gaza that was currently stymied, and yet here he is, still absolutely committed to this cause, and it's increasingly hard to understand why. The hostages are no longer cited as a motivation for doing it, and the idea of eradicating Hamas surely only stays alive in the minds of the most desperate and delusional supporters of Benjamin Netanyahu, because what would you do if those people over there killed your parents? Just think about it in such binary terms, such brutal terms. Would that make you less or more likely to be dedicated to enmity against those people? It seems to me that we've reached a point where people are implicitly or silently arguing that by killing your parents, I make you less likely to hate me. I feel free, please, to challenge me on this. That's what I hear now. I don't get that many calls anymore, but when we do, and you push people by just asking them politely and calmly the right questions, push them to the point where they're essentially arguing that by killing my parents, you're going to make me less likely to hate you. We're going to eradicate Hamas by killing all these civilians, catching up current terrorists in the net, and somehow magically ensuring that the orphaned children will not feel more sympathy with the retaliation than they will with the oppression. That's just how I'm seeing it now. I could be wrong. 24 after 11 is the time. Osama is in Leeds. Osama, what would you like to say?
James, good morning. Right, first-time caller.
Welcome.
I'm actually looking forward to reading your book, which I just ordered, and I'm going to pick up, having arrived.
Good man. I hope you're not trying to soften me up here.
I'm not trying to.
No, I'm very
up.
glad to hear
I'm actually intrigued as to how they broke Britain, and I'll tell you why. I don't know whether you're my generation or you lived in the 80s, but I certainly did.
Yes, I'm 52.
As much as probably being a northerner and yourself certainly on a certain spectrum of the political spectrum.
I'm going to encourage you politely to move towards the central point that you rang in with, because there are hundreds of people waiting to contribute.
After 3,000 deaths in Sabra and Shatila in 1982, Margaret Thatcher called it a barbaric act, got on the phone to Ronald Reagan and got a whole load of US and UK troops, as well as French and Italians, to protect Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon. After 30,000 deaths, probably even more under the rubble, no one will ever know, it took the deaths of 5 white-skinned people to move the West. And that is what has happened to our reputation. The Israelis and Netanyahu have literally taken our reputation as Britain, as the United States, as the EU, used it as toilet paper and flushed it down the loo in the entirety of the Arab, Muslim, and African world. The collateral damage here are not the human beings that are dying.
Yes.
That is an obscene term to use for a human being. It's an object. It makes them into an object.
Yeah, but it wasn't invented by the people that have used it here today. Let's be clear about that. It's in common military parlance. I find it pretty grim as well. But let's just to be clear.
It came about. I'll tell you when it came about in 1990 during the Iraq conflict, because we only ever see in the mainstream media in this country and the collective West dark-skinned people as objects. They are damaged, just like buildings. We don't see them as human beings. But that term came in after Thatcher had left. And that is where Britain had broken. There was a certain respect for the rule of law, which has gone completely out of the window. And what is worrying in all of this is our reputation. No one wants to listen to us. We can moralize as people in Africa. We can moralize as people in the Middle East and say human rights. The first thing they will say, you are not in a position to moralize at us, because look at what you're doing. The idea that what would happen and what happened to the Native Americans would never happen in this day and age, well, Gaza is proving that it's happening. Because essentially Palestinians were pushed onto reservations and not satisfied with pushing them into the world's largest prison, open-air prison camp, they are now being genocided. And that is where our reputation has gone. We are seen as racist, period.
And we pay so little attention to the parts of the world that you describe that we lack a full appreciation of just how severe this reversal has been, or just how severe this situation has become. And therefore, you would file the events of the last week, the political events, as a consequence of the killing of those aid workers. You would file it under far too little, far too late.
Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what the perception is. I was actually bizarrely walking through Dubai Airport. The person said to me, "Yeah, they only moved when white people died. When dark-skinned people were dying in their dozens, no one cares."
You see, I disagree with that. I know that may be me speaking from a position. No, I can't disagree with that being the perception. But I think that if the British aid workers, the ex-British military servicemen who were targeted and killed this week by the Israeli Defence Force were black British former servicemen, I think the words British former servicemen would carry more resonance than the word black or white in that context. I could be wrong.
Well, we have a certain, shall we say, identity, right? It is our exceptional identity. Or as
yes, that's why I think. I mean, relativism or exceptionalism, whatever you want to call it, I think it's British in this case rather than white. But you can't change the perception that is created in the rest of the world by the difference in response. And there's no counterfactual here. We can't prove it one way or the other.
I'll give you the difference. You know what the difference is now in Britain, what it was in the 80s? Look at the difference between David Mellor in the West Bank back in 1987.
Yes.
When he saw Palestinian kids having their arms broken for throwing stones. Look at the outrage that James Whale actually exhibited in a late-in call-in show on Radio Air in 1987 about how can you justify breaking the arms of people. And now look at where they are now. Look at comparing.
I don't know where they are now, but you're speaking rhetorically. I mean, you're comparing David Mellor to Suella Braverman. I don't know where James Whale, formerly of this parish, is now. But oddly enough, I was listening to Radio Air in 1987 under the duvets in my Yorkshire boarding school. But just to be clear, because we've run out of time, what you're pointing out is the diminishment of the United Kingdom as any form of moral arbiter.
Absolutely.
And that is something that will take, I did suggest this an hour ago, that is something that will take generations to repair, if indeed it is reparable in any way. Because I think that much of what Osama says is indisputable, is that, you've got Suella Braverman in Israel denying reality because she's been shown some photographs by the people doing the things that are being criticised by the rest of the world. And she was Home Secretary 10 minutes ago, twice. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 11. Shortly after 11:45 this morning, we'll be joined by Sophia Orr, who is an 18-year-old Israeli who's just been released from prison because she is one of only 3 people to have publicly refused to serve in the Israeli Defence Force since October the 7th. It's a remarkable story that perhaps hasn't received the coverage that it might have done over here. That may not be true, actually. I should probably stop saying that quite so often. But because I'd have to be watching the news and reading everything 24/7, wouldn't I, in order to make those sort of claims. But it is a fascinating story. She's a fascinating woman, and you can meet her in just over 10 minutes' time. Before that, a couple more calls on this question of Netanyahu's determination to pursue a course that I think it's fair to say almost everybody, up to and including historic and committed allies, now wish he would abandon. So why won't he? A lot of answers, none of them definitive. None of them could possibly be definitive, but very, very high up the list comes the question of personal vanity, personal survival, a sort of narcissistic need to retain power and to fend off the legal, never mind political problems by which he was beset before Hamas attacked Israel on October the 7th. So, and as a very cynical reading of events under which Hamas, and I've read this in broader analysis, under which Hamas did him a favour on October the 7th by bringing the necessity of robust response front and centre and crowding out, I think probably correctly, any other considerations from Israeli politics. But the argument put forward by a very first caller today, Sylvie in Harrow, who described herself as a proud British Jew, that in many ways Netanyahu has subsequently done Hamas the mother of all favours by creating the environment that we are surveying today. And that is why it is so confusing, perhaps, still, that he continues on this course, even as it appears to do more damage to Israel moving forward than it does to... well, it obviously can't do more damage to Israel than it does to Palestinian people. They've been killed in their thousands, but it does more damage to Israel than other courses would do. 11:35 is the time. Steve is in Burgess Hill. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. Thanks for taking my call. I'd just like to raise a couple of points on the use of lethal force. From the perspective of a former UK military serviceman, and also from I currently am a humanitarian aid security advisor.
So doing the kind of work that the 3 men killed in Gaza were doing?
Yeah, precisely, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So take the first one, the use of lethal force. So in any type of military rules of engagement, it's driven into us through, repetitive training. You have to use the minimum force to save life. So, and the only time that you ordinarily would attempt to take a life is just to save somebody else's life.
Okay.
And that's where minimum force comes into it. So whenever there's a deliberate fire action, it's intentional in regard for that. So that whenever you're pointing a weapon or a bigger type munition that's going to do something in order to save life, it's the consequences of that. So it's the very strict criteria that we have to abide by, in conflict as well as in peacetime.
Yes.
So that's really the first point from the perspective of somebody, carrying a weapon in a theatre environment. Moving on to the other side, the humanitarian side, and in terms of what happened to the international, the ITK, I can't remember the acronym, kitchen. What happened to them the other day was, again, that was from my own personal perspective, a fully intentional act. What they did, they definitely were not using minimum force, because if they were trying to use some type of minimum force, they could have interdicted them vehicles by using some of their ground units. They had full eyes on the cars the whole time before they engaged with the airstrikes. So they could have sent some units, stopped the vehicles, taken people out, checked who was in them, let them go on their way. And if there was any terrorists inside, they could have apprehended them without killing anybody.
Well, they'd also been given the coordinates of the journey as well. The IDF had been given the coordinates of the journey as well.
Absolutely that. And this is where I put on sort of my other hat as a security advisor as well. That's what we have to do in these types of environments. So, our first asset is our people, is our teams, because without them, the aid doesn't work at all. So we have to protect them. So we put all of our measures in place, our control measures, to prevent such incidents occurring. So when we do go down a cleared route, for example, we know that it's going to be safe from anything that's unforeseen. And if I can make comparisons to the other sort of theatres of operations where we work in, either Somalia, Nigeria, Afghanistan,
yes.
We have a fixed amount of threats normally, and they're basically the same. So there could be Al-Shabaab, there could be Boko Haram, it could be the Taliban, for example.
Right.
But we know what to expect with these. The difference is with this case, particularly this case inside Gaza this week, was that them traditional threats that we normally protect ourselves from.
Yes.
That was not the thing that got these people killed. It was the Israeli Defense Force that got them killed. Now, we have literally no way of protecting ourselves from that, because ordinarily in the countries where we operate, the security forces and the local police are the people that are there to ensure our protection as well.
Yes.
But this has been inversed in this case. And that's the thing.
And yet simultaneously, up to and including a former Prime Minister of Israel, I keep reading that they've done more than any other army in history to minimise civilian casualties and to ensure that the operations are undertaken with the preservation of life being prioritised at every turn, even as the numbers and analysis like yours suggests the polar opposite. It's a bizarre situation.
It's clear, and it's clearly not true though as well, because I said this to your colleague as well.
Yes.
Ironically, and please don't criticise me for saying this, but ironically, I feel safe for our teams who are operating currently in Afghanistan at the moment, because we know that the security has been controlled by the Taliban, and although they have we have other risks that they're posed by them, what they don't do is they don't shoot us directly and they don't drop bombs on us. We have other risks associated with them, but it's definitely not those. The ones that the humanitarians are facing in the Gaza Strip right now, and then to a lesser extent in the West Bank, are some of the people that are there in order to prevent us being attacked by terrorists, let's say.
Yes. But there's nothing you can do about this. Nothing you can do about this.
Yeah, and they're causing a bigger problem for us. Yes.
Steve, thank you. I'm going to move on because I have some breaking news, which is almost unbearably apposite. In fact, talking to Michael earlier, who was in Tel Aviv, the suggestion that I came pretty close to suggesting that I wouldn't be surprised if the IDF claimed that they thought they were Hamas terrorists in this convoy pretty soon. I didn't say it out loud because it may have been a little irresponsible, but I couldn't see any way out of the reality except to posit the possibility that, oh no, we thought there were some terrorists in that aid convoy. I can tell you that in the last few minutes, the Israeli Defense Force has issued a statement in which it claims that they believed there was a Hamas gunman. I'll read it to you. The event occurred on April the 1st, 2024, during an operation to transfer humanitarian aid from the World Community Kitchen to the Gaza Strip. The investigation found that the forces identified a gunman on one of the aid trucks, following which they identified an additional gunman. After the vehicles left the warehouse where the aid had been unloaded, one of the commanders mistakenly assumed that the gunmen were located inside the accompanying vehicles and that these were Hamas terrorists. The forces did not identify the vehicles in question as being associated with World Community Kitchen. Following a misidentification by the forces, remember they'd been given the coordinates of the journey, the forces targeted the 3 WCK vehicles based on the misclassification of the event and misidentification of the vehicles as having Hamas operatives inside them, with the resulting strike leading to the deaths of 7 innocent humanitarian aid workers. The strikes on the 3 vehicles were carried out in serious violation of the commands and IDF standard operating procedures. Accordingly, this is not from the actual statement. The IDF has said it suspended senior officers from the unit involved in the incident from duty. So I'm afraid that would, under our earlier caller's definition, that would get filed under collateral damage, because if they say, oh no, we thought there was a terrorist in the car, then it becomes somehow justifiable. Dave suggests that the IDF is trolling the whole world now. But the speed with which that has happened, so shortly after I alluded to the possibility of it happening, the claim that, oh no, we thought there was an IDF person in the car. The speed is quite unnerving, actually, isn't it? It's 11:43. I'll squeeze in one more call on this, and then, of course, we will meet the young woman who's just been released from prison after refusing to fight in or serve in the IDF, an 18-year-old woman. Zara's in Southwark. Zara, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Zara.
Hello. I think basically, for me, having listened to all of this, as everything's been continuing, it's becoming increasingly clear that the sole aim or the sole purpose of Netanyahu was complete eradication. If there's nobody left, then there's not going to be anybody else who hates Israel or blames Israel for the death of their parents or their siblings or anything else like that. That could only logically be, their end goal. And the reason why the world has sat back and watched is because over the last 30 years or so, there's been a systematic dehumanization of Palestinian people in particular, and Muslims more generally,
That has helped, although, there was also inhuman activity on October the 7th in Israel, which is a huge part of the international response. In fact, the inadequacy, perhaps, of the international response. But we can't gloss over that, Zara.
No, but then I think the thing when it comes to things like this is that you can't gloss over that. And, go back to those old sayings and say, you know what, 2 wrongs don't make a right, because then other people will turn around and say, well, actually, you've got the 7th of October, but let's look back at the entire course of this conflict, going right back into the 1940s. Where do you want to stop? It's going to be a case of one-upmanship the whole time,
Well, which is another reason why the people who simultaneously ignore the fact that we repeatedly mention Hamas and the hostages and claim that the conversation is unfairly ignoring Hamas and the hostages are so disingenuous, because, as you remind us, and as earlier callers, notably I think Osama in Leeds and others, this problem didn't begin on October the 7th. So, the idea that you could have a conversation pretending that it did is a little naive, isn't it?
And that's it. And you know what? It's not going to end on October the 7th, because now I, as a mum, have my 8 and 9-year-old children coming to me and saying, Mummy, why don't people like Muslim people? Yeah. Mummy, why do they call us terrorists?
And so do Jewish mums. So do Jewish mums.
Of course, but it's a case of when is this going to stop? I think that ultimately, and for me, that one of the things is people talk about 2-state solutions and this and that and the other. But if there's ever going to be, because the Israeli state has complete control over Gaza, it's not autonomous. They don't have access to their borders. They don't have access to their power supply, their water supply, any of their utilities, even their food. It all has to come through Israel, right? So if we were to have that kind of enclave here in the UK, could you imagine it? If we weren't all governed by the same set of laws and everything else, if the whole country, just give it a new name, I don't know, call it whatever you like, and make everybody a citizen and everybody equal, that's going to be the only way to fix this.
Yeah, although God knows what would happen if you did that tomorrow. I do agree with you that seems, well, I've said many, many times, there are 3 outcomes here. Either one side eradicates the other, or the other side eradicates the other, or both sides somehow find a way of living in peace and harmony. Don't forget, you could get suspended from the Labour Party. You could get suspended from Keir Starmer's Labour Party for calling for Palestinian and Jewish people to live in peace from the river to the sea. If your name was Andy MacDonald, happily he's been reinstated. But another illustration, perhaps, of where Western politicians were when this began. I think we can all agree, if we can agree about anything, that they're not in those positions anymore. Zara, thank you. After the break, we will meet Sophia Orr, an 18-year-old Israeli woman who has just been released from prison in Israel. She was incarcerated after refusing to serve in the IDF since October the 7th. A remarkable story, which we will find out more about after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
Quick heads up, I may be preparing to say warm words about David Cameron before the end of the programme today, although with the obvious caveat that he is ultimately responsible for much of the madness that has swept the country since 2010. He's recorded a short film at the NATO summit, which has drawn an awful lot of praise from some quarters, although I'm quite amused by the programme director at the Institute for Government, Tim Durant, saying, "I'm sorry, is the commentariat getting excited because a government minister can walk and talk at the same time?" And I'd say to Tim Durant, mate, have you been paying attention? Compared to some of the people that have been government ministers in recent years, or indeed deputy chairs of the Conservative Party, the ability to walk and talk at the same time definitely constitutes cause for celebration. But we return first to matters Middle Eastern, matters specifically Israeli, and we speak to Sophia Orr, an 18-year-old Israeli woman who has just been released from prison, where she was incarcerated because she's one of only three young people in Israel to have publicly refused to serve in the IDF since that October the 7th terror attack on Israeli soil by Hamas. The first Tal Mitnick was jailed in December, and Ben Arad became the third this week. Sophia sat between the two of them and was the second to be jailed. And Sophia joins me now. Sophia, thank you for your time this morning. To begin with the obvious question, why did you refuse to serve in the IDF?
Hi, thank you for the opportunity.
Hello.
I've made the decision to refuse to join the IDF before the war. I've made that decision a few years ago because for me, the occupation and the constant discrimination and oppression against the Palestinian people that the IDF enacts both in Gaza and in the West Bank were and are still enough to refuse and to try and raise a voice against those kind of actions. And since October 7th and since the war started, I've only became more sure of it. And it only became more important for me to make that decision. And that decision is both a resistance for myself and a resistance against those violent actions, but also to raise a voice and to try and reach Israeli society and young people in Israeli society and to show them that this is an option and to try and promote a voice of peace where it isn't being heard.
Have you known then, since you first arrived at this conviction, that it would eventually end in you being jailed?
Yes, I knew that was the most likely result of that kind of decision, and I've made my peace with it a long time ago, and now that it is here, I'm dealing with it one day at a time.
What was your imprisonment like? What was your experience in jail?
I've been in prison 2 times until now for 40 days, and it's a very interesting experience. You meet people that you won't meet, that I personally wouldn't meet anywhere else, and have conversations that I wouldn't have anywhere else. And it also is making it even more apparent how this war is hurting the Israeli society and Israeli people, the way that deserters are being punished way more harshly now, because prison is mostly filled with deserters.
Really?
That deserted for economic or medical or family reasons and were unable to go to the army or continue serving in the army and are now being sentenced for way longer than they were before the war. And having conversations with those kind of people and seeing the way that the army is not only inhumane to Palestinians, but also inhumane to its own soldiers. and that this system needs a change from the root.
So
these kind of policies need a change.
So the punishment is not proving an effective deterrent for you?
No, I mean, the punishment is meant to deter me, but it is not, because it's important for me, and it's an important thing to do, and it's the right thing to do.
I mentioned that you're one of 3 young Israeli teenagers to be jailed for refusing service since October the 7th. You'll forgive me for not knowing what the statistics are more generally, more broadly, but if somebody listening to this was to conclude from that your position is not popular among your generation or among your peers, would that be a fair conclusion?
Very much so. My position was not popular before the war, and it is even less popular now since the war started. The Israeli society has always been extremely right-wing and very militaristic. And since the war started, and since October 7th, it has only been shifting more and more to the right, and especially young people who are maybe only now just getting into politics, and this is the kind of situation that they are getting themselves into, and they feel that being a soldier is an honor, that they are protecting their country, that they are doing something that is just. And I mean, the Israeli society doesn't accept the decision that I make and doesn't support it. And I've gotten harsh threats or comments, I've gotten into fights about this kind of decision. So very much not a popular stance to take in Israel. Not before, and especially not now.
What do you think it is about your journey to this position that why you have ended up at this conclusion, which is at odds with so many of your own generation? What is it about your experiences?
I think a lot of it comes to the education and the way you were brought up. I think that is true for anyone, and in any kind of family that they grow up in. I grew up in a non-Zionist family, but also it very much depends on the mere action of asking questions. Of when I get to the age where I, like everyone else, every young person in Israel starts to think about their military service, that they have no choice to do, that is mandatory, and that when I got to the kind of age that I started to think about it, I also started to ask myself questions. If I go and serve in the army, what does my time mean? What does that service mean? Who does it help? What kind of cause am I actually serving if I go and invest that time? And when I started asking those questions, I also got answers. And I realized that if I go and serve in the army, I don't serve the people around me. I serve a cycle of violence. And I legitimize and normalize this cycle of violence. And it became clear to me that I have to not just not enlist, but I have to take action against it.
Do you know where you would have been deployed if you had enlisted? Do you know what you would have been doing?
Generally so.
Right.
But I don't have any specific role of mine. I know generally in communications I was supposed to be.
I see. And the decision to go public, I think you've just alluded to, not enlisting is one thing, but going very public with your decision not to enlist, I think, is another. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so. Because not enlisting is something that way more people do than you might think.
The IDF don't publish the numbers, actually, but you made a conscious decision to go public, which is what leads to the imprisonment, I think.
Yeah, there is a part, there is the refusing to enlist, and there is the making it public and making a public statement about it. Because refusing to enlist is in some ways for me, for my own moral conscience, that is important for me to stay clean and to be faithful to my beliefs. But making it public is an attempt to raise a voice for peace and to try and reach other people with that kind of message and to convey it to as many people as I can.
And how do you measure whether or not that's working, Sophia?
I mean, when I see a post, for example, and I mean, if it's in Hebrew, the large majority of the comments will be violent and hateful. But if there's 1,000 comments and 999 of them are that kind, but one of them says, that made me think, that made me question something, then it's worth it. Then it's working. Because one person is still an impact. And I do what I can as one person, as an 18-year-old girl can. And if I manage to reach anyone, even slightly, then for me it's worth it.
2 more questions. Thank you for your time. The first is, I hope this isn't a silly question. Do you fear for your safety, even out, or perhaps especially outside prison?
I don't fear for my safety. For my physical safety, but it does have social repercussions. People who might recognize me, they might get violent. I haven't experienced that yet, but in general, most of the cost is social. Okay. Because it's being a public person with a very polarizing opinion inside Israel.
And I sense that your position isn't going to change anytime soon. So do you know when you would be likely to be returned to jail?
Soon. I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly when, but I will return there soon. I will refuse again, and I will not yield that kind of decision and that kind of stance that I'm taking.
What happens, Sophia? Sorry, my final question. What happens? The people literally knock on your door and take you away?
No, I go...
You present yourself at a...
I go to the enlistment center where they judge me for any number of days, and then I go back to prison to serve those number of days, get out, and do it again until one of us gives up. And it's not going to be me.
You mentioned social media messages giving you hope and encouragement. I wonder if you'd let me read you a few that have just come in while you've been talking to me, and then I will bid you farewell. Lucy writes, 18 years old, I feel hopeful for the future of Israel. Anne writes, such an impressive young woman. She is absolutely right about the need to ask questions, especially in times when emotions run high. The courage and conviction, writes Dave, of this person is inspiring. Andrew writes, what a courageous woman. Nargis says this Israeli woman is a real hero. God damn, writes another texter, what a brave and principled woman. Huge respect to her. Mohammed writes, the world needs this young, peace-loving girl. I hope many are listening to her and share her social network account. There's a big difference here. Please send Sophia our love and admiration, writes Brian. The courage and conviction of this person is extraordinary. I could go on. The young lady makes me, says Pat. This young lady makes me want to be a better person.
Thank you so much.
Sophia, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity and your time and the messages.
And take care. It is 3 minutes after 12. There were plenty more messages, actually. And you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
7 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A complete change of direction now, and in fact a decision taken in the last 90 seconds as a consequence of Thomas's news bulletin reporting upon the plight of William Ragg, chairman of a Commons Select Committee, member of the Common Sense group of Conservatives, I think, somewhat ironically, who has found himself in all manner of trouble after sending what are described as intimate photographs of himself to a complete stranger that he'd met on a dating app, a gay dating app in this case. And I mention that because it might be pertinent to the questions that I'm about to somewhat uncomfortably and in a very English fashion ask you. Grindr, it's called, if you were interested. He's the vice chair of the 1922 committee. I mean, he's a senior Tory backbencher. And he sent what are described as intimate pictures of himself, and then became scared that the recipient had compromised, I'm quoting him now, had compromising things on me, and therefore handed over the numbers, the telephone numbers, the contact details of colleagues, including several MPs, members of their staff, and a political journalist. They then received unsolicited, flirtatious messages from senders identifying themselves as Charlie or Abby. And this is the point where perhaps our interest becomes even more acute. Aubrey Allegretti, who has covered this story in extraordinary detail for the Times newspaper, is a brilliant young journalist. I think he came to one of my events when he was a student with his mum. That's how old I am now. I'm reading front page stories from the Times newspaper written by a journalist who came to one of my events years and years ago with his mum. Oh, my days. But anyway, he writes that it is understood that 2 MPs responded by sending an explicit picture of themselves. Now, there is a rhyming phrase to describe the sort of explicit pictures that I think we are discussing here, and that is not a phrase that I want you to share on the radio, obviously. The sort of end of pier giggle response to this is perhaps inevitable, but I would caution you to remember that these MPs didn't know who they were sending these messages to. It could have been a Russian spy or a Chinese spy or any old spy. It could have been a security breach. The grounds for blackmail, particularly when homosexuality was still criminalised, the grounds for blackmail were of enormous concern to security services. They've used the phrase honey trap to describe this, and more often, I think than not, honey traps are deployed in issues of espionage. What does Vladimir Putin have on Donald Trump is a question that I've heard asked in many, many quarters. But, what does this complete, as yet unidentified stranger have on these 3 MPs? Answer, pictures of them in compromising situations, intimate pictures of them. So I mentioned oddly to an earlier caller, because he was wondering about my age and experience, not in a dating app kind of way, I hasten to add. But I mentioned to an earlier caller that I'm 52 years old. I'll mention that again now to you. I think it might be more relevant that I've been married for 25 years in May. And therefore I was, I don't want to say taken, but I was out of the game long before internet dating became a thing. In fact, I'm so old that I've attended weddings where the bride and groom didn't want anyone in the congregation to know that they'd met on a dating app because it still had a sort of air of, I suppose at worst, desperation, and at best unexpectedness to it. Now, I can't imagine anybody's embarrassed about having met on a dating app. A lot of you are telling me that Grindr isn't technically a dating app, it's more of a hookup app. That is a distinction that is, I understand that distinction, but I think for the purposes of our conversation today, it is somewhat lost on me. My only real experience of this is when Roman Culkin, what's his real name? Kieran Culkin, who was playing Roman Roy in Succession, accidentally sent a picture of his own member to his dad. That was a moment. There were a million moments in Succession of absolutely magnificent dramatic impact. That was probably the one that had me wincing and cringing in horror more than any other. But it speaks also to a kind of perception that this is normal behaviour, that this is not extraordinary behaviour. The only story here is that he got caught. He succumbed to a request that was not made in good faith. Whoever issued the request wasn't particularly interested in seeing intimate pictures of William Ragg. Instead, he was interested in using those pictures as leverage with which to secure other unsolicited, other contact details to which they could then send unsolicited flirtatious messages. And presumably the hope was that they would lure a public figure into a scandalous situation. Here are the details. Speaking himself, to the Times. William Ragg says, they had compromising things on me. They wouldn't leave me alone. They would ask for people. I gave them some numbers, not all of them. I told him to stop. He's manipulated me, and now I've hurt other people. I got chatting to a guy on an app, and we exchanged pictures. We were meant to meet up for drinks, but then didn't. Then he started asking for numbers of people. I was worried because he had stuff on me, which suggests it wasn't a headshot, was it? It wasn't like a passport photo that was sent in this instance. I was worried because he had stuff on me. He gave me a WhatsApp number, which doesn't work now. I've hurt people by being weak. I was scared. I'm mortified. I'm so sorry my weakness has caused other people hurt. Now, you can attack me for this if you want, but you read those words and don't feel some sympathy for the fella, then you're made of sterner stuff than I am. I think he's been broken by this. I think he may have taken time off from Parliament for mental health reasons previously, and this can't have helped. And I'm not going to be joining in any witch hunts or attacks on him. I might find his politics ridiculous or abhorrent, but this is a story about a human being who's got himself into a terrible situation and feels absolutely devastated as a result, not just because he got caught, but even if he hadn't been caught, the consequences of what he did have caused embarrassment, hurt and upset for other people. Ruby takes a different perspective. She writes, not a shred of empathy for this MP. Don't send pictures that could be used against you. He could have gone straight to the Commons police and they could have tried to trace and possibly arrest the person or persons responsible. You then fall into the trap of using some of the language that I can't use on the radio, Ruby, but that's fine because it's in a text. Excuse me. The reason I mention it, my age, is because I just have no idea about this world. No idea at all. Is there and you're going to be my tour guides through the world of unsolicited intimate photographs. Is there a difference? I presume there's a difference. Well, perhaps naively, I presume that the fact that this is a gay dating app is pertinent, is relevant. I presume that gay men are more likely to send pictures of their penises to each other, which I have to presume is what was contained within this picture, because otherwise why on earth would it be embarrassing? I presume that's more commonplace on a gay dating app than it is elsewhere. But why would anybody, in any circumstances, send a picture of their penis? Here's a phone-in that you weren't expecting to be taking part in today, isn't there? Or maybe you were, in which case you'll already have your answer ready. So all I need to do is remind you of the number. Why does this work? I was always amused. I forget who did this joke. I was always amused by the idea of a little boy asking his dad how their parents met. And the dad responds, well, son, it's funny you should ask me that. I leant out of my van window and complimented your mother upon the size of her breasts. And the joke is, of course, that it's highly unlikely that don't text me now to tell me that that's exactly how you met your husband. It's highly unlikely that any romances have begun in those circumstances. Now, clearly I'm out of touch with modernity or reality on this, because I can't quite believe that this leads to long and meaningful relationships or even fruitful congress. I can't, you send a picture of your plonker to a complete stranger, and as a consequence of that, you hook up. Is it an exclusively gay thing? Is it something that goes on heterosexual dating apps? And I don't want to ask, does it work? Because that sounds like I'm flirting with the idea of trying it. But how? I mean, it must work, doesn't it? Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. I can't do a phone-in on how out of touch I sound but I'm a sort of spluttering incomprehension. 0345. Well, by work, I mean, does it actually lead to? So if you've got several contacts on Grindr or what's the other one called? Not Minder. That's a television program. What's the Tinder? And the ones with whom you're most likely to make physical contact. The likelihood of making physical contact with this person is enhanced by the sharing of an intimate picture. Is that just true? Or are people firing off these plonker pictures into the ether? I just don't get any of it. But and also, how could this happen here? How could 3 MPs all send pictures of their plonker to a complete stranger without recognising that? I mean, I don't get it. And I think you can tell that I don't get it. I'm not my usual articulate self. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I may even be sufficiently naive and out of the loop to not understand why such a picture would enhance the likelihood of a physical contact. I mean, what's happened to the days when you put great sense of humour, GSOH, on a dating ad? Surely that's I don't know. Shall we open up the phone lines and see what happens? I think we should. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. And I suppose I'd like to talk to you if you've ever done it. Why would you do it? Tell me why you would do it. Phone lines are open.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
I won't be opening any attachments if you choose to WhatsApp me in the course of the next 40 minutes. I just want to make that absolutely clear from the very start, okay? Heavens above. Heavens above. And Ewan has been in touch to say every day's a school day, James. I thought GSOH stood for good shoes, own hair. I suppose it depends what demographic that you're operating in, but I don't quite understand the world in which no fewer than 3 MPs can respond to unsolicited flirtation by a complete stranger by sending pictures of their plonker. And I'm just interested to know how normal you think that is. Paco is in Battersea to kick things off. Paco, what can you tell me?
Well, I can tell you that it's perfectly normal in the gay community for this to take place.
From sort of the first point of contact?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if it's not done on the first point of contact, you're not going to speak to the person in the second sentence. Or the second word, I should say.
I don't know why my follow-up questions go now, Paco.
Well,
I mean, I've got a few, but I'm conscious of the time of day. Do we need trigger warnings?
Yeah, but I wanted to mention the reason why this has been made such a big story.
Yes, if you would.
Is because this similar thing happened in Germany.
Oh yeah.
A few years ago. I have a friend who was in the parliament in the Bundestag.
Yes.
And the gentleman had done exactly the same thing. He was an MP. He sent a picture of his todger to somebody, and then they tried to blackmail him.
Yes.
But when the press started coming round, he went to his leader of the party, and he told the leader, and the leader said, "So it's normal. That's just normal. Yeah. It's normal because you know, if they're more relaxed on the continent, we're more uptight. We've always been uptight.
Yeah. And
the only reason we got equal age of consent was because of Europe. If we hadn't have had the age of consent equalised, Europe would have forced us to do it anyway because we were in Europe at the time."
Is that right?
Yeah. That's right.
Well, I don't want to rain on David Cameron's parade. I think his commitment to equal marriage was very, very real. I know you're talking about the age of consent rather than equal marriage, but there was some, just some genuinely progressive motivations in those things, even though what you say is true. I don't know if I can ask you the question that I want to ask you, Paco. I mean, you're not qualified to answer one of them, which is whether it's more of a gay thing than a straight thing.
Well, I am bisexual, so
then you're perfectly qualified. Then off you go.
Yeah, it does happen in the other side as well.
Does it?
But no, it's not as important. You know.
No. Well, that leads me to my second question.
Right.
And I'd ask you, and you've been very diplomatic already, but I'd ask you to double down on the diplomatic language.
Right.
What are you seeking to establish / convey?
Well, the thing is, and there was a programme, I think about 10 years ago.
Hang on, I just need to talk to Keith. Stay there a second. Oh. Just keep an eye on the button, yeah? All right, carry on, Paco.
There was a programme about 10 years ago.
Yes.
It was called The Trouble with Gay Men.
Right.
And it was a program, I've forgotten who did it, but it was another gay man who did it. And he was accused of being homophobic, even though he was gay himself.
Right.
And it's basically a lot of gay people, not saying all gay people, but the majority, I would say, are only interested in sex. They don't want a relationship. They only want sex. It's gratification.
When they're on these apps,
that's how it is.
I mean, they might be in a relationship or looking for a relationship in broader life.
There's a lot of that going on too.
But you go onto this app. A friend of mine once told me a genuinely extraordinary story about using this app. This particular app on a Friday night, and he hooked up with someone and went back to their flat, and then he was in the same part of town about a week and a half later, and he thought, I've got a few hours to kill. So he went on it again and hooked up with someone else and went back to the same flat. And they were partners, and neither of them knew that the other one was on the app looking for local activity at the time. So that supports your thesis somewhat. But I still haven't had an answer to my question. I know that you're looking for a sexual encounter.
Yeah.
But what does the picture of the... someone's texted me to say, I love the idea of the... Connor says, I like to think that the perpetrator of this scheme has a little photo album labelled Members of Parliament. So what do you seek to establish or convey via the medium of...
That's how you attract the person or get their attention, because a lot of people are interested in the shape or the length or the thickness, or there's a whole variety of things.
There it is.
And that's the reason.
Right. Blimey. Have you ever... I mean, is this... what if you used somebody else's?
Well, this is the problem.
I bet it is.
Yeah, this is the problem. And that's why there's a video function on there where you can speak to the person live on video. A cam call, or whatever it's called.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So then you can't pretend you've got something you haven't got.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
I know exactly what
I know. On the camera.
I know exactly what you mean.
And you're not going to meet them unless you do, because they're not. It's the same with a face photo. If you don't send a face photo as well, then that's it.
So it's like I mean, in Victorian times, ladies would go round and leave their card at a home prior to a tea time appointment or something like that. And now this is a form of calling card. Well, you live and learn. Just on a scale of 1 to 10, how naive do I sound to you? 11.
2, maybe.
Oh, okay. That's all right. Thank you. 26 minutes after 12. Good luck, Paco. There's a few things there to unpick. The idea that it is never part of the courtship process. It's solely about a hookup. The idea that it is... Emma's not happy with me for suggesting that it was more of a gay thing than a straight thing. They write, it's a bit weird to suggest that nudes are more of a gay thing. Well, a nude in general, I think, is a bit different, but I don't know what I'm talking about. I think I've made that pretty clear. But the idea that we should feel sympathy for these politicians because what they have done is utterly unremarkable is one that I'd like to explore a little further. It's 12:27. Mark's in Nottingham. Mark, what would you like to say?
Sorry, I've just...
I bet you didn't think this was going to happen when you woke up this morning, did you?
No, not for LBC. No, not at all.
Can we all spare a thought for John, who's just texted me to say, I've just switched my wireless on, James. What on earth is going on? So, thoughts and prayers with John. Why did you ring in, Mark? What do you want to tell us?
Grindr used to be what it has been labelled as a dating app.
Yeah.
But very quickly became the hookup app that everybody has.
Right.
And when I say everybody, I literally do mean everybody.
Well, you don't.
So you
don't, but you do. You don't mean everybody. You don't literally mean everybody, because I haven't got it. But you mean in the gay community, pretty much every.
In the I'm curious community, in the I'm bisexual community, the amount of guys that are on there that are leading a very happy life with misses and whatnot at home, and you'll find them on there. It has a very unique message tone, which is also quite interesting when you stood in the crowd and you hear that go off, because it's like, oh, someone else is on.
Right.
It's just really is quite a bizarre thing how it took off and how it becomes so successful.
And how quickly did the photographs become an integral part of the process?
I would say that was pretty much straight away.
You see, I'm not gauche or innocent. I've got a lot. I don't want to sound like one of those. I've got a lot of gay friends. I had no idea that the aesthetics of a penis were so important.
Or a bum, or whatever it is on a body that...
So what are these MPs most likely to have sent a picture of to this complete stranger?
It's most likely something that's within their pants.
Yes.
To be politically correct for this time of day.
Well, that's very kind of you. I'm normally quite dismissive of the notion of political correctness, but I think on this occasion it's probably helpful. And how shocked are you by the story? I mean, this is, I think, where the world divides, isn't it? Between people who think, but what's the big deal about this? And people who go, Jesus, Mary and Joseph and the wee donkey, what on earth were they thinking?
So, not surprised by it in the slightest. I've had someone try and blackmail me before on it.
Have you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Who were they threatening to show your pictures to?
They were threatening to show it to family, to friends, to work colleagues, to which I'm all out to anyway.
So there was no embarrassment. It'd just be a bit weird for someone to be doing that, really. It'd be more...
Yeah.
What did you do? How did you deal with that, Mark? What did you do? Did you just say, go on then, do your worst, you silly old sausage, if you pardon the pun?
Pretty much just something to that effect, yeah.
Yeah, and it didn't happen. They didn't go ahead with it.
It didn't go through with it because they found that they weren't going to get any financial reward from it.
I wonder how widespread that is, though. I wonder whether this person was actually in it for money rather than news stories. Mark, thank you. I feel that my knowledge is growing by the minute. 12:30 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The phone lines are open, 0345 6060 973. Karen says, I'd be more interested in the shape of a man's bottom. Thanks for sharing, Karen. Amelia Cox has the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:33 is the time. Even I can't make that joke work, but I'm also thinking of David Cameron at the moment, oddly, and the quality of a contribution he's made to public discourse. Now, look, David Cameron gets a whole chapter in my book, my late, I can't really call it my new book anymore. Paperback's out on April the 25th. I would wait for the paperback if you were thinking of buying it, because A, it's got a new chapter in it. If I run through who gets a chapter, right? Rupert Murdoch, Paul Dacre, Andrew Neil, Matthew Elliott, Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Jeremy Corbyn, Liz Truss. Who have I missed out? I've missed one out. There's one more. There's one more. Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Liz Truss. Anyway, who would be chapter 11? I've missed it. Who would be? I've written a new chapter for how they broke Britain. Who do you think would have been the most obvious candidate to come in at 11? And it's really obvious. It's Rishi Sunak. Is chapter 11. But crucially, Suella Braverman and 30p Lee were the people I chose to prove how awful Rishi Sunak's judgment is. And I'd just like to thank them both for proving the point beyond my wildest dreams in the weeks since I submitted the manuscript, the final manuscript for that paperback chapter. So I mention that because I'm not doing the curse of O'Brien on David Cameron. I think his reputation is irredeemable, but it doesn't mean he can't occasionally do the right thing. And he's recorded, I think, a really powerful little piece at the NATO summit that I may play to you shortly. I've also, of course, got a little clip of this week's Full Disclosure, which is with the writer and mental health activist Bryony Gordon, who I've known pretty much all my adult life, but certainly all her adult life. It's extraordinary to sit down with her and reflect upon the astonishing work that she has done in that field. I am, Jason, in response to your question, I am planning to make the Audible chapter available to everybody, whether they've bought the book or not. Because I just thought that was the best way of doing it, you know. So you can't, if you've bought the audio book, you can't really be expected to buy an update to it. So I'm just going to try. I think I've cleared this with Penguin. If I haven't, I apologise. Then everyone's sending through texts. Did I not say Paul Dacre? Did I not say Paul Dacre? If I didn't say Paul Dacre, he is indeed one of the people who merits an entire chapter. And no, actually, Nick Ferrari doesn't, whoever sent that text in. 12:36 is the time. Speaking of politicians, I'm exploring the world in which three of them would send a picture of their todger, as Paco chose to call it, or plonker, as I have somewhat felicitously settled upon, to complete strangers. And it would appear to be quite normal behaviour. So if we could extend it slightly into the world of straight people, or comment on the politics of it, as someone who understands the dating side of it, what is your response to the idea that a politician could have engaged so blithely in this sort of behaviour? All right, there are a couple of phone lines free. 0345 6060 973. You see, because I'm with Laura on this. She writes, "Hi James, I'm a teacher, and I wouldn't send nudes or anything because of my professional status that my role holds. I think it might be quite a normal thing to be sending pictures, but MPs should also be thinking about their status in society and what effect it could have if the pics got out." That's where I'm coming from. That's where I'm coming from as well. You just sort of think, well, I'm not going to do that. But possibly these lads wouldn't get any action at all if they... I don't know, and that's why you're here to help. Liam's in Folkestone. Liam, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Our first-time caller. What a subject.
Interesting. You've chosen your moment, haven't you, Liam? Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I might be able to offer you some perspective on what you just asked. I'm a civil servant.
Perfect. Yes.
By no means am I sort of near the top of the food chain, but we have a very stringent set of rules that we have to follow in terms of not compromising ourselves, not giving away any personal information.
Yes, yes. Well, you'd hope so, because of foreign agents and other things.
Absolutely. I mean, to give you an example of how strict it is, one of the things we're discouraged from doing is if, for example, you buy a new house and you sort of published a photo of you with a door key outside your front door on social media, that's deemed that's personal information and someone could work your address out from that. So that's one of the things we're explicitly forbidden from doing, let alone sharing sort of explicit images.
So do you feel a bit aggrieved about it? I mean, because William Ragg is keeping the whip, which is not in any way, in my case, an attempt at a pun, but I realised as the words came out of my mouth that it could be construed as such. He's keeping the whip. I have no idea where the whip's featured in any of the photographs that we're discussing obliquely here. Do you feel a bit aggrieved about that? Is it as if there is a higher standard for you as a civil servant than there is for him as a politician?
Well, I think slightly. I mean, I agree with you. I do feel really sorry for him.
Yes, I do too. I'm surprised how sorry I feel for him. I think it's the nature of the language. It's the... I'm mortified. I'm sorry my weakness has caused other people hurt. I've hurt people by being weak. He's gone further than most politicians go in an apology. Michael Fabricant has had to apologise to Dale Vince today for believing some nonsense that was spouted by that weirdo Guido Fawkes. And his apology is much more like a typical politician's apology. This seems quite an emotional apology, doesn't it?
I agree completely, and I think it seems really heartfelt, and I'm inclined to believe that he's genuinely really remorseful. But I use Grindr, and I agree with what's been said before, that it's very few people, I think, use it to find love or to find dates.
Okay.
It is solely for sort of one sort of thing, and explicit pictures are 10 a penny.
Right.
Lots of people will start a conversation with those, which is an interesting way to say hello.
Isn't it?
But I don't share them myself.
Because of your job? Or because of your... I don't know what the word would be. Reservations. Modesty is nice, yes.
I think, but I mean, definitely because of my job. But even before I had this job, I'm 38. So, and it's, to me, I think that's that borderline age of just about understanding it. But yeah, it's not for me. It's sort of sharing that around. And also, as highlighted by this case, you have no idea who you're sending them to, really. You have no idea who's at the other end of that line. And there are all sorts of...
Well, that's the bit that I find strange, actually. It's amazing how people's attitudes to this are different. So Helen says, OMG, James, is my response. As a woman, nothing gets sent until I've met the guy. Absolutely nothing. But, of course, other people respond like Mark, who says, does Laura mean that if she wasn't a teacher, she would send nudes? I wouldn't send nudes because it's a blooming weird thing to do. No sane person would do it. So I think they're both straight, but the idea that it's actually quite normal, but not if you haven't met, and then the idea that it's completely abnormal and why the hell would anybody do it at all, both seem to me to be perfectly reasonable positions, even though they're entirely at odds with each other. It's the idea of sending it to a stranger that I find amazing.
Me too. That's the thing, and I think it is so normalised on there that, I mean, Grindr has a private gallery, so you can upload personal pictures and then you can share that private gallery with people. So you don't even have to click each individual picture. So that's how sort of normalised it is. For me, it's the stranger element that certainly puts me off. You don't know who they are, and to be frank, you don't know how old they are. There's no, you don't have to
can't you count the rings
how to verify your
sorry.
Oh, that was an open goal there.
Well, I didn't see that coming, but there we go. So it is. I mean, I think if I was gay, I'd be like you.
Well, there's no age verification process on that, James. So you really don't know. You could be getting yourself into all sorts of legal trouble as well. So I'm certainly, until I've met somebody, I wouldn't do it. But I do have a theory on I think particularly with gay men. I mean, I've said to friends before, some straight friends, what we do tend to be really good at, we're very open at talking about sex. Yes. And I think that's for reasons, I think historically we've had to be. Yes. And so we're not that uncomfortable at talking to each other about sex. We don't have that sort of, no sex, please, we're British attitude to it. We're quite upfront, and I think it does fall into that. And also, I do think it's. I don't want to sound older than I am, but I think it's sort of this is the times now. I've got a friend, a girl who went out clubbing, and she was interested in some guy, and he showed some interest. And then when she asked whether he wanted to take numbers, he looked at her up and down. He's going, and she said she could see him mentally deciding whether to swipe left or right. She was right in front of him. Wow. And I do think that's what maybe the modern dating scene has become.
Completely definitely. Objectified, willingly, consensual objectification is what we're describing.
Absolutely, and instant gratification.
Which is, I mean, why people are bombarding me with explanations that it's hookup, not dating, which is where you began as well. And that does lend itself more, but by no means exclusively, to the gay scene than it does the straight scene. So, particularly, I think, for women, who are more likely to be looking for a relationship than they are just for a casual encounter. Although I say more likely, I'm not suggesting for a minute that women don't also look for and enjoy casual encounters. There's a new book being published, actually. I was reading an excerpt from it in the Times the other day. Thank you, Liam. And there it is. So, I mean, you've covered a heck of a lot of ground, because in a way it's unfair that politicians would be held to a lower account than civil servants. And it's probably also unfair, and there's a degree of cognitive dissonance here, to expect politicians to be punished for doing something that is completely commonplace, completely unremarkable in the eyes of many, 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 many people. It's coming up to 1:45. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:48. This is interesting from Ronnie. We could talk further about this, but we don't have time today. Ronnie writes, I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham. Honestly, with Balama earlier, you wait ages for a PhD student to come along, and then two come along at once. At the University of Birmingham, exploring image-based sexual abuse. This was what is formerly known as revenge pornography, and the impact that it has on LGBTQ individuals. Our international studies show that men particularly are susceptible to extortion and threats to share. Presumably, this is me talking now, not Ronnie, presumably because they are closeted or living as straight men and having gay encounters secretly. And therefore the grounds for blackmail and leverage would be great. We also find that minority groups are more likely to experience this type of behaviour, possibly because some minority groups are more likely to be in the categories that I've just described. That's fascinating, Ronnie. A fascinating PhD as well. Farhan is in Walthamstow. Farhan, what would you like to say?
Salam, James. Yeah, I wanted to add my perspective as a gay Muslim that's actually used these gay dating apps, not just here in this geography, but in the Muslim world quite a lot, actually, in places like Turkey and Qatar, where actually they're very popular, James. Are they? But yeah, of course they are. Yeah, we all have needs, James. Yes. We all have needs, and gay men, we have needs that are not deemed to be appropriate enough to be in the public domain, and that.
Well, not here. Maybe in Qatar, where it would be, presumably, it's still an imprisonable offence, is it, in Qatar? I think it is.
It is, yeah.
You need to be very careful.
It's a glaring indictment, James, of the fact that homophobia does still really exist in our society here.
Do you think so? Tell me more.
Yes. Well, this politician was trying to address his needs, okay? As a biological driver.
I'm going to argue with you here.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because, I mean, we are because I think William Ragg is... Well, I think we knew before this that William Ragg was gay, and Grindr is obviously a gay dating app. But I'm pretty sure that if an MP thought he was sending a picture of his penis to a woman, the story would be the same, wouldn't it?
Oh, I think it'd be a lot worse.
Oh, so where's the homophobia then?
Oh, you caught me.
That's what I do.
I know, you're so good at it, James, honestly. You're a honeypot. You're doing a honeypot on me right now. No, do you know what? Listen, I think I'd have to disagree with you, because the thing is, it really broke my heart to hear the words of apology coming from William doing something, and the same with Philip Schofield apologising for being gay, basically. You know,
well, no, he was apologising for lying to Coy. It was a slight. We don't need to bring Philip Schofield into this conversation, but just to address directly what you said, he was in at least as much trouble for lying to colleagues and for the fact that the young man with whom he had a relationship was very young when they first met. There was a lot more to it than that, than the William Ragg story.
When I'm kind of online and I do chat with, faceless profiles, as we call them, and typically they will be, a majority of them will be Muslim. They'll, when they interact with me, maybe feel a bit safe with me, because I'm very, I put my face out there. I'm out loud and proud.
But most of the men you hook up with are not.
No, I don't. I'm not that prolific, James.
No, I know. Well, you're talking in code, and I'm trying to read, and I'm watching the clock. I've got clips to play. I'm trying to get to the meat of the story.
You'd be hard pressed to get pardon the pun.
Yes.
To actually even see a face most of the time. You'll see the members, because that's what they want. They want something. They want to address their needs, James. And you know what? We're entering a kind of an age now where actually that's okay. It's all right to want to have your needs addressed, and I'm struggling with it because I've been brought up to feel ashamed of sending even like a topless pic out there. I used to get told by my sister, how dare you take a picture without your top on and all that. All this shame, But the people that are sending, their pictures of their members and things like that, they're trying to get their needs met, and it's very dysfunctional because they feel too ashamed.
Yeah, it's good that we can argue about this, because I don't think that William Ragg is apologising for being gay. I think he's apologising for sharing telephone numbers of others. So what's sad is that society is still, in his view, hang on. In his view, society is still structured in such a way that if this were to come out, and I don't know who'd print the pictures anyway, to be honest with you, because I don't think that any newspaper ever prints pictures like that. But he was sufficiently frightened to allow a blackmailer to exercise leverage over him, and he's apologising more for succumbing to the blackmail than he is for sending pictures of his own penis, or indeed for being gay. So I don't know.
Well, that's precisely my point, James. He was afraid of the fact that his constituents and things like that would see him addressing his needs just being...
They would see his penis. That's what he was afraid of.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Because he's not closeted. He's not closeted. There's no suggestion he was worried that his constituents would be perturbed by discovering that he was gay.
I'll be honest with you, James. I've been to so many clothing optional gay events now in places like Sitges, in Mykonos, even out in Palm Springs, California.
Yes.
I'm used to seeing these. They're just like, it's just an extra bit of flesh that just happens to dangle between the legs.
Yeah.
Like, what's the big deal? Can't we all just be like adult about this?
Well, I was on a nudist beach in Crete myself not long ago, and I know it's one of the least sexual environments I've ever been on in my life. Full of hairy Germans, Farhan.
That's true, actually.
To the left of me, to the right of me, bang flipping in front of me. So there was absolutely nothing erotic. I think that nudist beaches are probably the least erotic places on the planet. But I take your point, and you're clearly a bit ahead of the curve on where society should be going. And if society had already gone there, then William Ragg would have been essentially unblackmailable, if that's even a word. But thank you for that. I just still think that as a politician, regardless of what motivates the response, the ill-advisedness of it. If society is still a place where blackmail can occur, then politicians should be on their guard even more than anybody else should, even as we could all agree that this is not behaviour that should be subject to possible blackmail anyway. Thank you, Farhan. 12:55 is the time. I want to play you a little clip of this week's Full Disclosure with Bryony Gordon, the author and journalist, who has really done extraordinary work over the last 10 years in the field of mental health activism, addressing all sorts of issues from an incredibly personal perspective, very, very confessional journalism, but in the finest possible sense of the word. And I'll share some details of her new book with you after you've had a listen to this. But she writes a lot in the new book about OCD, which has become happily and relieved many people are to see it something that now gets talked about and acknowledged a lot more readily than it would have done previously. And you're about to hear talking about when it first appeared in her life, and it just gives you an indication of two things: one, what it's actually like, and two, how deeply irresponsible anybody who sort of claims that it's either doesn't exist or is just a sort of normal part of growing up, how deeply irresponsible and even dangerous those people are.
It's weird to think about my childhood because on the face of it, I had a very happy, idyllic middle-class childhood. Lived in a terrace house in West London. There was a Volvo, private school, all of that. But I think back to my childhood, and I was in a perpetual state of terror. I was worried about things that I think childhood is quite frightening.
Yes.
I think it really is, and I think we underestimate that. And we often dismiss it as well. I always remember my daughter saying to me that she was scared of mosquitoes when she was about 4, and I instinctively wanted to go, don't be ridiculous. Yeah. But it was a real thing that she feared, and I feared things like nuclear war, flooding. There were things that I'd picked up reading about, and I'd picked up on the news or seen in newspapers. But I was also really frightened of other bizarre things like aliens in the attic. Or I remember when I was about 11, I thought I was pregnant with an alien, which looking back was not normal.
No, and we're talking like nail shredding anxiety, not just passing.
No, like really the only thing I could focus on. Like the only thing I could focus on. And then it sort of, I would like to say culminated, but the moment I feel where it really passed over from sort of nail shredding anxiety into some like a full-blown disorder, I was about 12, and I woke up one morning and I was convinced that I was dying of AIDS. It was just that was all I knew. And I don't know if at the time, it was about 1992, there was this incredibly shaming public health campaign about AIDS and HIV and don't die of ignorance and all of that. Yeah, of course. And I became convinced that I had HIV, but I didn't know it. And I was going to pass this on to my family. And if I didn't have it already, I was going to catch it I couldn't, a sofa that was red, I couldn't sit on because I wouldn't be able to see if there was blood. And I would wash my hands obsessively until they started bleeding. And I just remember this absolute, and it kind of, it chills me to think about it. It was Christmas, and I remember thinking, I remember seeing all my friends getting excited about Christmas, and I remember thinking, I wish I could be carefree. Yeah. Someone the other day, I used the word carefree about something the other day, and someone said, "Have you ever felt carefree, Bryony?" And I was like, "No, actually, I've never. Only when drunk."
Sure.
But so anyway, I remember just envying that feeling of just being a child and
just completely in the moment.
Yeah, and I was like, I'm going to die and my family don't know it, and if I don't die, I'm going to kill them, so I would sleep with like my toothbrush under my pillow, and then I would have to say all these phrases to make sure they were safe. So I had a much younger brother who was born when I was 12, and I would say, I'd rather I died than my brother. I'd rather I died than my brother. Again, like to this day, at the age of 43, I can still, there's still sort of like little internal jukeboxes that loop round and round, even though I know that they have no bearing on whether any of us live or die. But that was, and I didn't know what OCD was then.
It is just approaching 1 o'clock. That was Bryony Gordon on this week's Full Disclosure, and her new book, Mad Woman, is of invaluable assistance to anybody living with any of the issues she describes, or indeed living with any of the issues she did. That works, doesn't it, Sheila?
Just about,
was that English?
Yeah. That was definitely
That was
English,
recognised. Living with anybody, living with any of the issues that she writes about so powerfully and so movingly. Beautiful writer and a really, truly lovely person. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you.
James O'Brien on LBC.